Happy weekend, all my metrology mofos. This is Kevin, and you are listening to the weekend edition of the podcast, episode number 12. Today, we're going to talk about a calibration MVP.
It's been a long time coming. 6 days a week, 10 hours shift. What about the OT? Well, it ain't worth this. This ain't no 9 to 5 out here on these production lines. So I told them where to shut it, then they could read between the lines.
All right, so as with every weekend, we're putting this up on YouTube, so I'm doing the podcast with a little VCast to go with it. So what did we talk about this week? Because in case you want to go back, in case you're just checking me out on the video version of this for the first time, and you haven't heard the podcast, you can see what we talked about this week. So we started out this week talking about comparing apples to apples. The idea here is that different calibration companies can offer sort of various levels of options. And we want to make sure that when we're comparing prices between different companies that we're actually getting the same thing from both companies before we really compare those prices. Kind of an interesting concept, kind of an important one. A lot of companies will send you kind of their lowball calibration offering price, and then you might be comparing that to somebody's premium option and not be aware of that. So then on to Tuesday, we talked a bit about process control. Really cool stuff about how controllers actually do their voodoo, and kind of talked about how this works in the kitchen setting, talked about how your oven works, talked about how your thermostat in your house works. These are basic temperature controllers. Then we moved into a little bit of info on some more high-end industrial type equipment. Wednesday, our equipment day. Sounded like a boring topic to begin with, but it ended up getting kind of fun. We talked about stopwatches and measuring time. Then on Thursday, quality tool time for you. We did procedure mapping. Excellent stuff there. And then on Friday, got a little bit serious with the idea of calibrations for safety. There are certain calibrations that are done that are there to potentially save somebody's life. And I talked about those on Friday. So if you're interested in any of those, check out the podcast. You can find it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, pretty much all those different platforms. If you got an Echo, say, "Hey Alexa, play PT Guru's podcast," and it's going to do it. So check me out. I love that you listen. I'm so happy and so grateful for everybody that's checking me out on these things and is getting this info that I'm just giving away. So let's get right down to some content here. And today what we're going to talk about is developing an MVP in the world of calibration. So out there in the world of technology, we have a phrase that's called MVP, an acronym, be the better things. And for my sports friends, no, this does not mean most valuable player. Sorry. It's an acronym that refers to the idea of a minimum viable product. So an MVP gives you the ability to get your work out to the marketplace, be able to actually sell things. That's the idea here. We need to get to market with a product so that we can start making money, so that we can improve the product. This way we don't have to have a huge upfront, large amount of money just to get rolling when something may even prove to fail or not be all that good. So this super important concept in the world of calibration as well. In order to receive accreditation, talk about that all the time, the 17025 thing, for a particular type of measurement calibration, we're going to have to start out with some form of MVP. We want that minimum viable product. We want to get to market with it. So in this podcast, VCast, whatever you want to call it at this point, we're going to kind of dive into what goes into achieving this MVP that we need to get to the marketplace for a calibration. And now, be aware, an MVP is not a completely finished product. It's just like when you download an app from the App Store. It's not perfect when it just hits the market. It's maybe going to be a little glitchy. It's maybe going to have some issues. You're going to hope that those get fixed over time. That's the idea here. We're going to get to market and we're going to shake things out and see if we can make it perfect. It's going to take time to make it perfect, but let's be able to actually sell some product and in the process of making it perfect. And make sure that we've got a product that's enough to satisfy our customers' needs, but as time goes on, we're going to get better at it. So depending on the level of sort of change that you're dealing with to your particular scope of accreditation, there's a couple of different things that can happen here. The process for getting something added might be very, very simple, or it could be incredibly tedious and time consuming. So the first thing we really want to ask ourselves is, what are we trying to come to market with? This is an important question to think about. This is kind of the biz dev side of calibration. We need to kind of look at that part of things. Now, are we looking at this as simply a refinement or an extension of an existing class of measurements? This is pretty easy to deal with. And we're simply going to extend some ranges to correspond with new instrumentation that we're looking to perform calibrations on. If you're stepping into a whole new realm, this whole new class of measurements, then things might get a little more complicated. And that's probably going to be more what we're talking about here with this real MVP sort of idea, is really stepping into a new sort of discipline. Now, at that point, depending on your assessment body and depending on how much of a deviation this is from your existing scope of accreditation, your assessment body might ask for a full sort of assessment of these activities. However, it might be similar enough to things that you already do, where they say, okay, now we know you've got this basic sort of knowledge and process down. This is just really a refinement. So that's going to be up to the AB. It's on them at that point. You really just kind of have to go with what they ask you to do. Now, as a calibration lab, when you do decide you want to step into some new measurements, there's going to be a bunch of upfront overhead that's part of the game. Now, that you're going to have to buy some equipment likely. You're going to have to do some studies. You're going to have a fair bit of work and a lot of hours to put in addition to the cost of the new equipment. So make sure that you're leveraging costs versus the potential profit margin that a new discipline is going to get you into. Now, there's two ways to look at that profit side of things. If you are a lab that is maybe rounding out your calibration offering so that you can be more of a one-stop shop for your particular customer base, then you might not look at the actual profit margin of that particular item. You may even sell that item at a loss. But you're going to do it to round out the base to get more customers in general. So that's one way to look at it. The other thing is, this may be a completely new offering where you just need to be profitable. You want to do this new thing, and it in and of itself has to be profitable on its own. So if you're going to look at it from that perspective, do your homework first. This has bitten me before. I got into a particular market with a new offering, and it was a very easy offering. I even had all the equipment I needed to already do it. So it was just time in developing the actual process, procedures, and adding it to the scope of accreditation. Turns out, though, by the time I got into that market, it was a completely saturated market. And unfortunately, it was saturated with folks that are not accredited providers. Hence why I didn't see it when I did some really baseline looking into things. And it turns out that the folks that are in this market that are purchasing these services really don't need a 17025 accredited provider, so they're not willing to pay for it. Because to perform this particular measurement that I was doing at the time, it was pipettes in this case. To do these in a truly accredited way is a very time-consuming process. The process that these unaccredited providers perform is a much lower level of service than what's really required by the ISO standards. And we can get into the whole contract review and how you can get around some of that stuff and still be accredited. But just know, it was a saturated market. Nobody was willing to pay what we had to charge in order to make money off these calibrations doing all this ISO accredited requirements. So just be sure that you've got a market for this before you go and spend the money, put in all the time. Time is money. In fact, time is often more valuable than money in this kind of situation. So all that being said, if you decide to take that leap, get into a new discipline, let's talk about what an MVP is going to look like. We're going to have some steps here to deal with, and so I'm going to kind of break those down for you. First things first, we're going to need to look at the fact that we need to have the right equipment to perform the work. If we don't have the right equipment, dead in the water. End of story. Now, what we may look at is renting equipment, leasing equipment to get our foot in the door, get things kind of rolling. It's a good way to do things, not out quite the big spend this way. Or we may already have equipment that can do the job well enough for the situation. A lot of times I looked at this in my past lives of having a sort of minimum get to market situation where maybe I was using a less expensive piece of equipment, maybe I was leasing something, and maybe down the road, if it really proved to be a good offering, we could get that upgrade. We could justify the cost of, hey, the inexpensive load cells with the 0.5% accuracy are getting the job done. However, we're really starting to see a lot of these items, and we're really charging a fair amount of money for this. We've got a decent profit margin on this. It's time to up our game. And you can do that. That's part of the idea of getting in with the MVP and then transitioning over time to say, hey, this is profitable. This is a good spot to be in. And then you can upgrade. So, equipment, number one. The other thing we need to consider, and this gets forgotten a lot of times, is do we have a proper space to perform these measurements in? So now this may seem trivial when it comes to a lot of measurements. A lot of things that's just like, okay, I have a desk. That's what I need. And that's fine. A lot of cases that's going to be fine. However, if you're doing things like maybe pipettes, you need to have a controlled environment. If you're doing things like liquid flow meters, you really need to have some space to set up everything that you need to be able to do those. When you're doing high voltage measurements, you need some space to set up to be able to have safety when you're doing those kind of measurements. So consider the environment. It's one that gets glossed over almost every time, but it's so much easier to consider it up front instead of figuring out, I can do these measurements and then going, I've got nowhere to do these measurements. So next thing to consider is we need to have a proper method. Now, this may seem obvious again, but in all honesty, this is something that really can be a problem in certain cases. If you're coming to market with a new sort of offering, you might be doing something that people haven't done before, or that people that do perform these measurements like to be tight-lipped about. You run into this with some really proprietary stuff, manufacturer-only type situations. They don't like to talk about it, so then you're going to have to worry about developing something. So dollars for donuts, if you can use somebody else's method here so you don't have to do method validation and all that fun stuff that goes with it, use somebody else's procedure, their method. If it just doesn't exist, if that's not out there, know that you're going to be stuck doing some kind of method validation. Know that you're going to have to do a lot of work. You're going to have to collect a lot of data, prove that the method you're using that you've created in-house is valid and that it works. That's going to be a challenge at times. I promise you it's worth it, though. If you are looking for methods, don't just throw up your hands because an internet search is not really helping you out. Sometimes the info in this kind of world is a little tougher to find than what we would all like it to be. So the first thing you're going to do for methods, look to international and national standards. See if there's an ISO, see if there's an ASTM method, an ASME, any of those things. Start there. Next, if you aren't finding what you want there, or if it's too vague, you'll run into that with some of the standards. They'll simply say that, hey, you need to measure this, and they don't actually provide a method. They only provide a rudimentary set of guidelines as to what needs to get done. Then you may want to transfer over to GuideP. Guide up is something that we talked about in depth in an earlier podcast, so about methods. So check that out if you're interested in it. The Guide up is the government industry exchange program, and it provides a lot of good stuff for methods. And the nice thing with the Guide up sort of procedures is that they are very deep. They are very down into how do I actually do these measurements, as opposed to just saying, hey, this is the stuff that needs to get measured. So now we've got a method, we've got the equipment, and we've got a place to do this. So great stuff so far. Next in need to have is to make sure you figured out how you're going to document this calibration. Again, this seems obvious, but I've seen it bite people more than one time on sort of the backside. You pretty much already need to have this part established before you're going to have to go to market, because number one, it's going to make things easier. Number two, most ABs are going to want to see how you are presenting your data for a measurement, especially if you're stepping into a whole new set, a whole new sort of measurement thing, because it's gonna be different, especially if you're providing something new and different. Like stepping into pipettes required a whole new set of documentation to be performed, because it just doesn't match up exactly with how you do some other calibrations. You look at some numbers like averages and standard deviations, which is kind of a unique situation in the world of calibration. Most of the time in calibrations, we like actual exact measurements. We don't like to average things unless we really, really have to. It takes precision away from what we're doing. And of course, the next thing we need to have, the elephant in the room, my personal favorite, as you all know, is measurement uncertainty. Now, working on a completely new thing, expect measurement uncertainties that are larger than what you expect. And this is okay. They're going to get refined over time. The good thing here is if we start out a little on the measurement uncertainties being a little too big side, we're going to have a lot less questions from an assessment body, because they're going to look at it and go, okay, I can pretty much concur with that. If we go and just try to come to market with an uncertainty that's entirely too small, we're going to deal with a lot of questions, especially if we're doing this right off the bat. If you come to market and your assessment body is looking at a completely new thing and you have this infinitesimally small measurement uncertainty, they're going to ask you, what have you not considered in your measurement uncertainty? And they're going to want proof that you're actually capable of this, because they're going to look at this and go, hey, you're new to this sort of field here, so I'm not quite sure that you're considering everything if your measurement uncertainty is really that small. So looking at this measurement uncertainty, we need to treat it like any other measurement uncertainty. So we need to make sure that we have all of the right factors in there. We need all of the things that can impact this measurement. We're looking at a completely new discipline. We need to look at absolutely everything that could possibly affect this measurement. And that runs the gamut from the really big to the really small. Even if you know it doesn't impact the overall measurement uncertainty, get those really tiny things in there, just to have them as line items in the budget. Number one, this is going to cut down on questions. The assessor is going to look at your uncertainty budget and go, okay, you know what? You thought about it. Yep, that's a really tiny number, and it is 1/100th the size of other contributions in the budget, but you put it in there to say that you considered it. And potentially in the future, if you grow out of this budget and maybe layer on some other budgets, you don't add it to all the other budgets, because you go, hey, look at this budget over here. I already proved that it doesn't matter. So you then have the documentation to show it doesn't matter. It's too small. Who cares? Let's see, what else? There are going to be the assessment body realize that you have looked at things. That's what this is all about. It's the communication, the back and forth. They want to see that you've really considered, thought about, done your research to ensure that you covered everything that could have an impact, whether or not it does have an impact. So know that this is an MVP, and over time we're going to expect to refine it. We're going to expect to make it better. This is what continuous improvement is all about. The focus on ISO 17025 2005 is that continuous improvement piece. And that's not going away with the new version. We're still looking at continuous improvement. It's just we got this risk management thing that we're dealing with a lot more now. But we still want to get it better. So we need to get out there and, to use a sports analogy in this case, what we're really doing with the MVP is this is the first real swing of the bat. We're not trying to hit a home run. We're trying to get on base. So once you get on base, now it's easier to score because you're already 25% of the way there or more. So get yourself on base, then worry about trying to get to score before you just try to hit it out of the park, because if you just try to hit it out of the park from the beginning, more times than not, you're going to strike out. So when we got all this fun stuff established, we've got a method, we've got the equipment, we've got a place to do it, we've got a cert, we've got an uncertainty. All of those fun things. Now it's time to talk to your assessment body. Now, you can talk to them earlier, but it's easiest to have these things in line to be able to move very, very quickly. So now different ABs are going to have different requirements as to how they go about adding a scope expansion. So you're going to have to defer to what their advisement, their procedures, their requirements are, and how exactly they want you to submit that information. This might be for cost. It might not be, depending on the level of scrutiny that they require for you to add it. So depending on how different the sort of measurement is from the rest of your scope of accreditation, the assessments body is going to make a decision as to whether or not they require an actual physical visit with a sort of technical witnessing going on, or if the new parameter is close enough to things that you already do and it can simply be treated with a desk review. That's going to be up to them. Either way, you'll likely have some questions back and forth, which because you haven't explained things as well as maybe you should have, or because they want to make sure that you know what you're talking about. Sometimes they'll ask you questions just to see what your answer is going to be able to say, yep, you know what you're talking about. You've got this covered. You've done your research. You've done your homework. You've learned what you're doing before you've got here. So once you've addressed all of their questions and they decide that they're comfortable, they've decided that your measurement uncertainty is appropriate, that the measurement method that you're using is okay, that the calibration report certificate accurately reports the measurements and reflects the method well, now you're going to have something new on your scope of accreditation. Now, you should be well aware at this point that the work is not done. This is what I've been talking about this whole time. That's why this is an MVP situation. Much like the app in an app store, there's still lots of refinements and subtle changes to the method, to the measurement uncertainty that are going to need to happen. You need to keep up on your standards. They change, not frequently, but they do change over time. So if there's a new standard for pipettes, or the pipette standard changed for some reason, you're going to have to be up on that if that's what you're adding to your scope of accreditation. Because come a couple audit cycles later, assessment cycles later, they're going to be looking at that and saying, hey, why are you using the 2002 version of this ISO procedure when there's a 2015 version of this ISO procedure? And you're going to say, oops, and they're going to say NC, and you're going to have a lot of work to do. So it is a great feeling when you get to market with a new measurement for calibration. However, it's not the end of the story. It's just the beginning, and you need to treat it that way. Know that once you've added a new line item to your scope, you've added a new burden to your plate every year to refine, review, and continue to assess. So I hope this gets you to understand what goes into really adding an item to your scope of accreditation. If you're a purchaser of calibration services, this is what we need to go through. This is what the calibration lab goes through to get new items on to their scope of accreditation. So I'm Kevin. Let me know what you thought of this. Leave a comment below. Hit the website, www.ptguruconsulting.com. I love hearing from you guys. I love talking with you guys, chatting with you guys. When you hit the website, you can leave comments, questions there. I promise to get back to you. Scroll down, hit me up on my socials. Always great hearing from you. Hope you have a great weekend, and I'm going to talk to you again on Monday.